All right, so looking at the water, I do really like Worsley's, well, you probably can't see it. It's the classical 5-element acupuncture. I think I saw Melvin, you were looking at it yesterday. He has a really nice poetic way of describing the officials and their functions and as well as the nature of the elements. And to really understand, the elements and the officials, it's really imperative to spend time outside in nature. And by nature, I don't necessarily mean out in the woods. I grew up in cities, so nature could be in your neighborhood outside, where you feel the movements of the seasons at your latitude, as subtle or as extreme as they are, and to really get a sense of the natural phenomena that is associated with water and all its many ways it manifests, right? There's such a tremendous variety of water, right? There's these little tiny rivulets in streams, right? There's the water that comes out of your tap, right? The rivers, the lakes, the oceans, right? And so these are all the many ways water reveals itself, as well as the wintertime. What happens to life in the season of the winter? How do the animals behave? What happens to all the different varieties of plants? What seems to thrive? What doesn't seem to thrive? How do the different plants, manage this season of, less light and more cold, especially at this latitude, right? And then also notice what happens to you in your body during the winter time. Does something enliven? Do you hate it? Is it just neutral and just doesn't really make much of a difference in your demeanor or your spirit? So notice what happens to your chi. Notice what happens to your body. Notice how your mind responds to that. And that's what you want to get into when you're with your patients, is you want to gently inquire into that. And, a lot of people aren't really consciously aware of it. Some do. And it's mostly temperature related or activity related, like, oh, I like to ski, or I hate the cold, or my symptoms get worse in the wintertime, or, oh, this is where I grew up, so I have this type of preference, and so on. But you really want to help the patients by your good questions to cultivate an observer about what happens to them in their body. What Ryan shows up in the wintertime, what Melvin shows up, when the season is darker and colder, okay, especially at this latitude, right? Okay, so we'll talk about the water just a little bit. Again, there's so many different aspects of water, and water is such a primal force in the health and the well-being of our system. It helps to give us our power, right? It's relatively more yin, right? So it's an actual substance. It's a substantial substance, not like qi or shen. That we have the blood, which is a fluid. We have the jin ye, which are the thin and thick fluids. And then we have the jing, which is a quasi-fluid, right? The essence, right? Which can manifest as a fluid, right? And so if you also think about the endocrine system, right? And the lymph, these are all liquids. So, water is so essential, along with air and oxygen and all the gases that are sort of dissolved into these fluids and carried by the fluids. So you could say, the water is like one of the most essential elements in our system because it's so fully integrated into everything, similar to the shen, and we'll get to that when we talk about the fire. So, this delicate balance of well-being is so dependent on the fluid dynamics and the health of the water, as well as the way it provides the reserves and the resources, similar to your automobile in a way. Like you've got the oil, right? You've got the gasoline, the fuel, you've got the literally the water, the radiator fluid, even the windshield washer fluid, right? So all of that, are really essential fluids in the maintenance of your vehicle to keep it cool and to keep it lubricated and to keep it clean, right? And to give it its power. And these are really the, and like say was it the ghost in the machine, that everything we create is going to be somehow a mirror to many aspects of who we are as beings. And so similarly, as well as on a body level that needs to be, cleansed, it needs to be washed, right? It needs the filth and the dirt and the pathogenic factors washed away. And we need the fluids to keep things calm and empowered, right? We need water to move the, sort of like, in a way, the kidney is sort of like the battery, because it moves water and salts across the fluid membrane, right? To keep us empowered, and also to circulate everything, right? Almost like the way the waterways were described in ancient China. These are the ways to get around, but not just to travel, but this was the primary means of communication. It was the safest and quickest means of communication between the emperor and the regional governors, where these representatives of the supreme controller, the emperor, would travel by boat, right, throughout the land, along the rivers and waterways, right? That was the safest way to reach the interior, right? You could walk, you could go by horse, but it was longer, it was not as safe, right? You're subject to more, bandits and things like that. So it was about communication and irrigation, which is nourishment, right? As well as like the transmission of, vital things, right? So the waterways brought the fish, the water life, right? The sea vegetables, the lake the river vegetables, the things that would irrigate the crops, right? So sustenance, nourishment, cleansing, communication, these are all ways that we describe the chi network, right? So on a mental level, we have a similar quality of the fluids bringing calm to the nervous system, right? If we get too hot, right, we get irritable. It affects the Shen, right? Similarly, the sort of brain chemistry, right, relies on the proper regulation of fluids in terms of the chemicals that are transported, the neurotransmitters, the neurochemicals. They keep our brain functioning, they keep our mood intact, right? As well as keep the nervous system functioning properly. Because if we become too dehydrated, the nervous system starts to overheat, right? And doesn't transmit neurotransmitters properly. And that affects our mood, that affects our physical chemistry, it affects our thermostat, right? And then on the spirit level, how do we feel refreshed? How do we feel empowered? And how do we feel connected in terms of like our intuition, right? Not just connected to other people through our Shen, but how do we feel connected to our own source and our own inner nature, right? And this is what empowers our intuition and our ability to meditate and gain greater insight and awareness. All right. Any questions about the water in the wintertime? As I'm drinking my water. All right. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the bladder. So in the Ling Shu of the Neijing in chapter 8, the authors describe the roles that were given to each of the organ systems that were likened to officials in the governance of the kingdom of the body, mind, spirit of the individual. And in a general way, just to kind of give you a sense of the water and the bladder, in chapter 8 of the Tao Te Ching, right? Just to quote this little bit, part of the chapter. In dwelling, we closed to the land. Oh, sorry. In dwelling, be close to the land. Sorry. In dwelling, be close to the land. In meditation, go deep in the heart. In dealing with others, be gentle and kind. In speech, be true. In ruling, be just. In business, be competent. In action, watch the timing. No fight, no blame. And this describes this quality of flow in your relationships with yourself and relationships with others. So, the yin and the yang officials, it's important that they communicate with one another and that they work in harmony with one another. In the water element, especially if they're not working properly, what happens is inappropriate fear starts to arise, even though there's no immediate threat, or we lose our capacity to connect to our heart. We lose our capacity to connect to our heart through the kidney, and therefore we can't access our will, and therefore we can't be a powerful force in this world, right? So, there's some major themes around the water CF, and we'll talk about how these themes show up for the bladder and how these themes show up for the kidney, especially in terms of like the more, what we would call the more spiritual, the more subtle or behavioral aspects of the people who resonate with the water, i.e. water constitutions or water CFs. So some of the biggest needs that you'll notice with the water CF is a need for security, a need to feel safe. And in order to be safe, you have to be able to trust. And you have to be able to be reassured. And you also have to be wary of what is a threat and what is not a threat. And in order to move through life, you have to have a certain amount of drive, which comes from your will, right? The jur. And we've talked about the five Shen in an earlier class, right? So this is the will that can't be willed. This is like at a most fundamental level, this will be like your will to live, your will for self-preservation, right? The survival instincts, right? These are the things that kick in without you really thinking. Your reflexes, right? If something comes towards you, you react, you have a reflex, right? You either duck, or you block, or you run away, or you fight, or you freeze and become paralyzed. So in a way, with a lot of the, and then you saw this actually yesterday, it was pretty interesting. Like they didn't really talk yesterday so much about their fears, which is kind of funny. I thought you guys might ask more into, what is it that you fear in life and how do you relate to an experience of safety in this world? So, but whatever, you can't cover everything. But this is like, and also you had, relatively healthy water CFs, right? These aren't, these are people who've like had a certain amount of experience of like self-contemplation just by virtue of being in the program, trimester 7 and, longtime practitioner. So they've had a certain amount of time to, for self-contemplation, self-assessment and cultivation, right? But a lot of your patients have not had that. So they'll come in and, they're mostly moving through life in a very reactionary way. They're probably authentic. If I'm being generous, most of your patients coming in that have not done a lot of inner work will probably be authentic and spontaneous and rooted in their deep nature in a healthy way, probably 5% of the time, if I'm being generous. So, but the big issues are like, how do I deal? So like, is this constant state of wariness. Like in a way, there's until one really does like a lot of inner work through meditation or qigong or athletics, or maybe like cultivation of self through development of like a skill like music or some hobby like art, things like that, where they can kind of lose themselves in something and kind of then see themselves in it. They're going to be aware that like one of the major filters that a lot of water CFs see through and experience and perceive the world through is what is the level of threat and danger in this moment, and what resources and strengths and capacities do I have in me to deal with that, to meet that, to navigate it, to manage it. So, like if I'm going into battle, what are the weapons that I'm carrying? Do I have like, body armor on? Do I have a helmet? Right? Do I have like protective gear? I don't want to go into battle wearing sandals, right? And a buck knife, right? No, right? I mean, like, so like, what protective gear do I have? That is like, what do I have in me that will help me deal with, in terms of like the virtues and strengths and capacities to deal with external threat? This is why a lot of water CFs often do a lot of working out to feel strong, right? Because if you feel strong, you feel less vulnerable, right? And I don't mean the pericardium vulnerable, where someone may see me for who I am and see the intimate nature of me, but, like, can I ward off an attacker, right? Like, so a lot of water CFs will learn to develop skills that help them feel more powerful in the world, or they may react the other way and rely on others for protection, right? So like, I know, remember, like, sometimes we go like to like one of the malls, like growing up as like a teenager or something, you like go into a mall, and there was always the girls that would hang out with the security guards, right? They were always interested in like those dudes, right? And I always had to chuckle because they were always the ones that were looking for like that sort of protector figure, like if you can't, or like, like people in school, like I went to an all boy Catholic school, and there was always like this couple of these like really like, and it was like predominantly our main sport was wrestling. I wasn't a wrestler, obviously. I was a baseball player, but Melvin, maybe you were the wrestler. but there was always these guys who would like sort of like hang out with like the guys on the football team, and they were all like, they would be like the equipment manager, and they're always kind of small, like, which is fine. I mean, there's no judgment, but they would be like the dudes, like, taking care of the guys who were like in the wrestling team or the football team, right? So they were people who were like attracted to people in power. Like they were always like the dudes who were like always into like hanging out with like the teachers and stuff like that, right? So, power is a main theme. Do I feel powerful? Can I exert power? And, oftentimes a lot of water CFs, they'll sort of look in the room that they're in, and they'll kind of identify the most powerful person there. And then they'll sort of strike up a relationship with them, because that's the tier they want to be in. Like that's their, right? Like seeks like, right? And then in that, who can I trust? How do I experience reassurance and safety? And there's a joke, that the only person who can reassure a water CF is themselves, right? I mean, you can't walk up to a water CF and say, no, it's going to be okay. You do not know it's going to be okay. You cannot know the future. It's absolutely uncertain. You cannot say that with 100% certainty that it's going to be okay. You can't. That's why you never, ever say that to a water CF, because it sounds like BS to them, because it is. You don't know. I mean, do you really know? No, we don't know, right? We don't know what the future is. They could walk outside and an anvil could hit them. Something could like be dumped from an aircraft flying over their head and kill them. It happens. It happens. The church roof could collapse, right? Right? So threats everywhere. It's everywhere. You never know. So this is sort of like, so this sense of readiness, this sense of wariness. And again, it may manifest in varying degrees, but this is going to be this sort of like default nervous system, parasympathetic nervous system play dynamic that figures very prominently with a lot of people that relate to the water. And so their actions, so they're going to have like this love-hate relationship with fear. In some aspects of life, they're going to show up as like maybe reckless. They might take extreme risks. Look at like these dudes and women that like are into the X Games, especially like the people that are like these giant, like the motorcyclists and the bicyclists that go off these like huge jumps. They're like 50 feet in the air and they come down. I'm sure the first time they did that, it didn't go so great, right? So these are like, back in my day in the 70s, we had Evel Knievel. So we were all building ramps and riding our bikes. We'd put ramps, like boards. We'd steal these, sorry to admit it, but we'd steal these boards and we'd prop them up against like cars in the neighborhood, and you'd go like terracing down the street and then hit the board and jump over the VW or whatever, and wreck and break bones, right? So that's so that's what we did. Evel Knievel was the man, right? So there's this weird sense of risk taking, either physically or financially, like people who are like really into gambling, right? As well as this sense of overcautiousness and risk aversion. So there's always going to be, this continuum of yang to yin. And then in terms of power, people may use their power to physically or through resources or their own intelligence, try to intimidate and dominate. And then on the opposite side, there's the people who, feel weak or feel powerless. And so they're constantly coming at life from this inner place that they feel overpowered, they feel oppressed, right? I look at people like the Oath Keepers. They're sort of like the doomsday prepper warrior, right? Like at any minute, the government's going to come in and take their guns and, I don't know, burn their house down. I don't know what, like just take like they're just going to be oppressed. It's so nebulous, right? So they have to defend themselves by putting up a good offense, right? So you see these guys, with their, M16, M1s, and these like AR-15 type rifles. So it's it's not a judgment, it's an assessment, right? So these are people that deal with feeling oppressed by trying to rise up and be powerful, and sort of like it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? And so, they feel intimidated, so they try to be intimidating, right? I mean, they'll show up to these gatherings with these, all these rifles. I mean, I don't know, if you're a politician and you're giving a speech and you see like half a dozen, a couple dozen people in the crowd with like rifles slung over their shoulder, like, are you going to feel safe? And I wouldn't, because they're not there to protect me. Right? So within that, though, when you tap into this jur will, you have your drive. So it might show up as people feeling driven, or they have no motivation. They're not driven. This is why, like, I'm not against marijuana. Like, it's like saying, well, I'm against, ivy, or I'm against, like roses. I mean, like, it's all medicine, right? So it's not against it or for it. It's just, it has its proper use. But a lot of marijuana, which affects the liver, will sedate the water. It makes it hard. If you smoke a lot of pot, it does sap your ambition. It saps your will. And I've seen it clinically, right? So there's something that happens when people have like no drive, right? And you can feel it in their presence, right? It feels sort of like in your, like this, the water is not moving. You know what I mean? There's this quality of stillness, but it doesn't feel serene, right? It feels stagnant. And then therefore, like we talk about drive and reactivity and wariness. And so this naturally implies the nervous system, as I mentioned, sympathetic, parasympathetic nervous system. So there's going to be this quality of like, if you could imagine water as being sort of a representative of the chi and the spirit, how is it flowing? Is it flowing appropriately? Now, again, you've all seen water in its many manifestations, and you've all seen rapids, like whitewater rapids. Maybe some of you have gone kayaking. Any of you guys, either of you guys like kayak or canoe or anything like that?
I have, and I've been whitewater rafting, but I don't do it regularly. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because you have so much time with school.
Yeah, exactly.
How about you, Melvin? You ever been on whitewater?
Not whitewater, but canoeing.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there's like a certain part of the river that sometimes, it flows a little bit more roughly and quickly and rapidly, especially if it's, been raining and the river is full. And that's natural, right? But it's contained, right? It's not flowing it's not flooding out, right? It's not overpowering the banks and flooding over, right? That's destructive. It's not, you don't want too little water in the river, and then it can't carry what it needs to carry downstream. It can't irrigate. So there's no communication, there's no nourishment. So, if you ever get a chance, go to Great Falls. That's really cool, right? Really, really neat. There's a Virginia side and a Maryland side, but you'll see a part where there's like, a lot of rocks underneath, right? Turbulence that creates this sort of like rapid movement. And there's this one area, like on the Maryland side, where if you're like walking over this little bridge, there's a sort of offshoot of the main river, the Patapsco, or Potomac, excuse me, where it kind of like there's this sort of like this little branch that comes off to the side, and it's really flowing very quickly through these banks, these rocky banks, and it's tremendously powerful because it's contained and it's moving really fast, so it could be destructive, but it's just really just creating it's just generating a lot of power, and it's not being destructive, right? So you'll feel it in their presence, right? In a way, like when you were listening to Sherry a little bit and Jesse more, although, and this stays with us, like I feel her try to nicify her power by bringing in the fire. Like she'll say something and then she'll laugh, but it's not a laugh that's like, oh, that was the best joke ever, let's everybody laugh. It was like a nervous laugh, right? It wasn't like a laugh that like you want to like, ha, 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 yeah, right? Like good one, right? It wasn't like the punchline of a joke. It was like, I'm saying something very intense and now I'm laughing, right? So there's a sort of way that we kind of have a relationship with our own intensity and power, and water CFs will feel, even in the case of Sherry, right? I mean, she was like, she's not going to like leap across the table and start beating you, right? I mean, she's not a threat. She's not a physical. I didn't feel like my physical safety was in jeopardy, but I do feel that there's some part of them that's ready to kind of like launch at any moment. And there's this quality of like this, when they're talking, it's just like, it's continuing to come at me and it's never ending and it's keeping going and it's going and now it's really going. I wonder when it's going to stop. It's never going to stop. It's going to go on forever, right? So there's that kind of quality, and that's how they experience power. It's that river that doesn't stop, right? It's that ocean current. It's that wave that's generated, in the middle of the Pacific and travels 1,500 miles to reach the shore, and it will do it. And there's no stopping it, right? You can't stand there and stop the wave, right? I mean, have you guys tried that? You go to the beach, remember when you're little kids, you try to punch the waves and, right? No, there's no stopping that. What happens? It just like it knocks you on your keister, right? So that's water, right? That's how people feel in their bodies, and they may not be aware of it. So if they're not aware of it, they don't know how to channel it. They don't know how to use it appropriately, and they may create negative stories about it that they either take on themselves and judge themselves and try and mitigate that. Like, I don't want to be too powerful. I mean, like, look at Jessie. I mean, she was like a hammer throw. I think she did hammer throw, right? I mean, those things are heavy, right? I mean, clearly she's a big gal, right? She's worked out a lot. She's very fit, very strong. She's got a strong physique, right? So, she's learned how to channel that in a way that generated skill and ability, right? She channeled her power. That's the kidneys. So these are going to be like some of the main themes for water. Any questions before we get into the individual officials? Okay. All right, so the bladder, and like I said, there's not a lot of things that I would memorize, but I would memorize the title and charge of the officials. So Panguang, the bladder, is responsible for regions and cities, right? And the transformation of the breaths, the chi, is what stems from it, right? So what does that mean, regions and cities? So it's basically the administration and the organization of the landscapes and the territories of the body. and the territories that are solid land and liquid water, just like the earth, right? So in a way, it's like it helps to organize the terrain, and it helps to organize the body fluids, and keep the fluids in the correct place, such as the saliva, the tears, the urine, right? These are all the jin, right? The jin ye. These are like the thin fluids, right? And then the ye is the thicker fluids. These are the cerebral spinal fluids. This is the fluids in your joints, the fluid in your ears, the fluid around your brain, the thicker part of your eye. So like there's an old saying like the jin ye, the jin are the fluids over the eye, and the ye are the fluids in the eye. Right, that's a way of thinking about it. So all like the really thick, right? That might even include like the lymph, what we would call like the lymph fluids. All of the really like thick, heavy fluids, right? All the thin ones that are relatively clear, saliva, sweat, urine, the water around your eyes, the tears, like these are all the thin fluids. So in a way, the bladder is kind of like the regions and cities are like the areas of your body that are likened to the organs, which are the cities. That's where like a lot of the activity happens. And then the regions are the more distal areas, right? So like there's a lot more activity that occurs in the lungs, the heart, the liver, the kidneys, even the foo, right? Those are the cities. That's where a lot of the activity of metabolism occurs. And then the regions are like your muscles, your bones, your arms, your legs, your hands, your head, your feet, right? Those are the regions. So in a way, it's sort of like the power and light company, as well as like all the utilities, like so water, power, and light. So it's in charge of like all the utilities of the body. They are generated in the organ systems and managed in the organs, and then they're distributed to the regions, right? The whole rest of the body. And so that's like what the bladder is in charge of. It's regulating that. So the kidneys, it's like the yang aspect of the kidneys in a sense, right? This is what gives out the power, right? When the organs are generating all of the qi and the things that regulate the qi, then in a sort of a theme of the power, that's what the bladder deals with. Okay. Just looking at my notes here. So in one sense, it could be like kind of like the reservoirs and the aqueducts, right? And that holds, along with the help of the spleen, because the spleen chi holds things in place, right? In a way that banks it, right? Just like earth controls water across the co-cycle, you've got this flesh under the domain of the earth and the spleen that's holding, that's maintaining the integrity of the bladder organ and all of the tissues that distribute the fluids. And then the power of that is regulated by the bladder, right? So, it manages all of the fluids that occur in and allow the organs to function, to generate the qi that then empowers the movements and distribution of these fluids to all four corners of the kingdom, to wherever it's needed. So it's about containment. Bladder contains the urine, and then about transformation. It said, so like, it's really interesting. There was this one of the four great masters in herbalism, and he was responsible for like, sort of like the fire school. And is one of my favorites. He's Liu Wan Su. He was actually like my favorite of the four great masters, and he of the Jin period. And so he said, roughly translated, there can be no transformation without a loss of fluids. I know that doesn't sound sexy, right? That's not going to be on a bumper sticker, right? You're going to, oh yeah, I can't wait to put that on my car. Right? There can be no true transformation without a loss of fluids or an exchange of fluids if you interpret it another way. And so I don't know if you've noticed as a patient, but a lot of times, like right after a treatment, and again, how long do they last? An hour, hour and a half? Like people really have to pee. And I'm like, oh, that's great, right? Because the transformation has happened, right? And that's what they mean. The transformation of the chi then gives out your power. When the water moves, that generates power. That's the whole nature of hydroelectric power, right? Even the ye old days, what did they do? They created like this water wheel, right? Over a stream, right? That had these like this big wheel made out of wood that had these little paddles in it, right? And the water stream would, hit the paddles that would move the wheel, that would turn the crank, that would, connect to a gear, that would turn like the grain grinding stone or whatever, or the windmill or whatever, right? So this is like life 101. This is power dynamics 101, right? They knew this in the 1300s, right? They knew this before then. So we all know that when the water moves, so they didn't have the same understanding of like the bladder and the urine that we do now, but they felt that like when you pee, like when you urinate, and that water moves, or the water moves from the kidneys into the bladder through the ureter, that was somehow like the river that moved the water wheel that empowered these functions in your body. And one of these functions is to get rid of the waste, get rid of the heat. So in a way, your bladder and your urine is sort of like a heat sink, in a way that just like the large lakes and oceans, they absorb a lot of the radiation from the sun and the heat. So it doesn't just all stay in the atmosphere, and we would be overheated, right? If we didn't have these giant heats. So water is like a heat sink. And so in a way, like the urine is kind of doing that. It's a way where like a lot of the heat in the body is sent through the fire officials into the bladder and into the urine. So when you eliminate that, like you cool the body. Like running water is cooler than still water, right? We all know that. You run your tap, right? If you want the coldest water, you don't just open the tap and put, turn on the faucet and put your glass in there. No, you let it run a while. We all instinctively know this. So in a way, the quality of cooling was a way of the quality of the power that was like wanted and needed. That like in a way, when you urinate, you're sort of like moving these fluids. When the body is moving fluids through the system, it's generating power, as well as being cleansed, as well as being nourished. So that's the whole power and light, right? We have a sewer system, right? That moves the liquid waste, not just the solid waste, right? So like that's the gray water tanks, right? So water generates power when it's moving, it cools and therefore is calming to the shen because heat agitates. It's nourishing because it brings life-giving water to a dry, needy area, a thirsty area, as well as it cleanses and purifies, right? We don't go outside and scrub ourselves with sand and dirt. I mean, you can, right? I mean, there's even in the Muslim tradition, like if you there's something called wudu, which is like an ablution where you put water over yourself in a certain way, in a certain order. You rinse your mouth out with water, you sniff a little bit up your nose, you wash off your hands and your arms. You probably have all seen like on movies or something, these like Muslims doing what's called wudu, which is like an ablution before prayer, because you want to cleanse yourself, right? They say if there's no water available, you can do this with dirt over your hands, like clean dirt, right? If you're out and they lived in the desert, right? So if they didn't have water available, they could use clean sand. That means sand that no one is, animals or humans haven't peed in or pooped in, right? You take clean sand and you obviously not put it in your mouth, but you like rub your hands and arms with it, and that sort of clean on your feet, and that cleans you, right? So we can do that, but that's not very refreshing. So the bladder shows up as this quality of unrefreshed, unclean, maybe a sense of like dirty, and that makes them agitated. So the spirit of the bladder often shows up as somebody who feels nervous, somebody who feels agitated, like almost as if they were like overheated, or like if you've ever been on a road trip or you've ever been somewhere where you really had to pee, you really had to urinate badly and you couldn't and you had to wait. Like, do you remember how that felt in your body?
I feel that like every day when I drive. Yeah.
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 Right,
seriously.
right. And like what do you want to do? You want to speed up. You're not going to slow down and like take in the sights. No, we get revved up, right? So like the nervous system gets activated, right? So, you know, that's like I just remember we used to fly to California a lot, and you know, when you're when you're in descent, right? You know, you have to keep your seat buckled, and there's a point in time where the flight attendant's not going to let you get up and move about the cabin or go to the restroom. You have to suck it up and wait. And I always had like the middle seat, right? So my wife wanted the window. So like there was no getting out, right? I always had like the world's, you know, fourth largest person sitting next to me, right? So you can't get, there's no escape, right? So, and it's agitating, right? So imagine feeling that way a lot of the time and not really knowing or having the self-awareness that, oh, this is just like my water constitutional nature asserting itself, right? So this gives you kind of like a sense of what the bladder is about. And sort of like on a mental emotional level, you'll see this in the bladder and the kidney, but especially the bladder, the patient may lack the ability to be introspective because they're not taking their shen from the heart and sending it or guiding it into their jing, which means I'm meditating on myself. I'm being contemplative. I'm turning my attention, shen, my awareness, shen, into my depths, my jing, my potential, my nature, right? And so they may lack the ability to be introspective and reflective because they're stuck in a pattern of habitual reaction to the presence of fear, right? That they may just sort of naturally gravitate to fear. So the bladder may be unable to communicate with the kidney and the kidney jing, and therefore can't access the inner resources such as one's inner wisdom and one's inner courage. And then without the kidney's wisdom, without the kidney's courage, the bladder is unable to assess the relevance and the appropriateness, propriety of any perceived threat. And oftentimes they project their unrealized fear, their unrealized, sense of threat externally into the world. So that looks like anxiety, that looks like overstimulation of the nervous system by the thoughts that are running consciously or subconsciously through their mind. And this usually manifests as a lot of like frenetic energy, fight or flight or freeze. So in a way, they're pissing away their chi, their resources, their reserves. They're the ones that like these two former acupuncture students. I mean, because you teach for a long time, everybody's your former student. So but these two colleagues of mine that graduated about like maybe like 12, 13 years ago, close friends of mine who are of course acupuncturists, were closer to them. So occasionally we would go on these vacations together. And the dude is like such a bladder CF. so we went and we rented this cabin, and there's like 8 of us, and he has of course he has a pickup, right? So he's got like, and so part of us, we're going like in these canoes. No, rafts. No, that's sorry. We were going tubing. We're going tubing. That's it. Yeah. This time we were going tubing. And so he had in his pickup, I mean, if nuclear war had broken out, he would have had what we needed. Like he had anti-venom. He had like every medical supply you could imagine. He had like the first aid kit that was like the gold standard of first aid kits, you know, like if you get hit with a bullet, you know what I mean? Like he could do it. He could take care of it. Like if you were stung by a wasp, he had that. I mean, he had like, you know, if you were bitten by a snake, I mean, he like had everything. He had everything. If like aliens had invaded, he'd had the gear. And you know, his wife is so funny. Like she's more like wood. I mean, he spent hours and hours and hours and hours and hours preparing all this stuff. And we used like maybe 2% of it. Like, oh, if you think you might be cold, I got these. And oh, I got an extra pair of water shoes. And I got this. And I got an extra, like, I brought you 2 extra pumps in case the first 2 pumps failed. I mean, he spent so much time and energy preparing for all of this. I'm thinking, damn. I mean, that's not relaxing. Like, you know what I mean? Like as a fire staff, I'm like, that doesn't sound very fun. Like, I'll be like, yeah, manage, you know, like we're not, you know, we're not idiots. I mean, we're clever enough. We'll think of something. But he had like it all, and like he just wasted so much money and time. And you know, to him, it's not a waste. It's like he can't settle unless that's in his truck. You know what I mean? So, you know, like to over prepare, like it requires a lot of chi, a lot of money, a lot of time. So like that's going to be something that shows up, especially with a water CF. A kidney CF, not so much. And so the way fear often shows up with a bladder is like it's much more yang in nature. There shows up with a lot more frenetic activity. It'll show up with more anxiety, right? And again, the bladder connects to the small intestine via the Xiaoyang, the Tai Yang, right? The greater yang, the outermost, and that is the outermost zone, right? I mean, when you learn the progression of disease, like in the Shanghun Lun, written by Zhang Zongjing, you'll see that like oftentimes there's sort of like layers to the body, right? And the way this one teacher talked about it, he said dark meat to light meat. So like what is most exposed to the skin, to the sun, and then to the least exposed to the skin. So the outermost layer, you know, when you're outside and maybe like working in a rice paddy, like the part of you that's going to get burned or dark first is the Tai Yang zone. That's moderated by the small intestine and the bladder. And so on a psycho-emotional level, this is like our first layer of armoring and protection. And the sorter carries the Shen of the heart to be aware of the surroundings and kind of triages our attention by saying, out of all the things to be aware of, I'm sorting out what to focus my attention, Shen awareness, Shen on at any given moment. And then combined with the bladder, that's your head on a swivel, right? So that's like to be aware of all of your surroundings, right? And because you're that first layer of protection against any threat. And those threats in traditional Chinese medicine are wind and cold. And that's what the Taiyang works with. So these are people that are often be dealing with physical or psycho-emotional themes relating to the wind and the cold, especially the cold, because that deals more with that affects more the lower body, right? The cold can enter the upper body, but cold, like water, seeks its own level, right? That's why when you get sick, it starts up here and then works down, right? It's not like you get a cold invasion of the feet. you know, right, right. It's like, oh yeah, my feet are really, really chilly, and then I start sneezing. No, it doesn't work that way, right? Like the wind drives in up here, and then we respond to the cold with something. And so in a way, that's like you're bracing yourself against the wind and the cold. What do? You hunker down. You don't go like this. Oh yeah, wind and cold. Oh yeah, great. No, we contract. So this is something that you'll see with bladder folks. There's a lot of contraction, a lot of retreating, a lot of curling up and protecting, right? Like the armadillo, right? That curls up, or the porcupine that curls up and sends its quills out, right? You know, or the possum, it plays dead, right? So there's this quality of like, and you'll feel it in their presence. They may not physically be doing it, although they might physically have that comportment. If you look at Sherry, I mean, like, she was always kind of curled over. Every now and then she'd get excited about something and she'd kind of open up and then she'd curl over again. It wasn't like, you know, like curling up into a fetal position, but she was kind of curled in, right? So that's this quality of, you know, you've sort of like, what's the energy behind their posture? What's the energy behind the themes of what they're talking about? And you may feel very cold or contracted in their presence. You may feel fearful of them or threatened by them, or you may feel like that they're reacting to you almost like a threat, right? And so what they often do is, in order to feel protected, they have to feel very wary, and that burns up the nervous system. And this is why they often go, and then crash. Go, and then crash. Go, and then crash. And they don't like that, because to stop moving is equal in the deep subconscious that the mind, the primal mind, equates that with death. Yeah. So these are some of the themes that kind of show up with water CF and bladder in particular, which will show up as a little bit more yang and therefore a little bit more activity, but it's not as focused. So it kind of floods out, which then is the self-fulfilling prophecy of burning up their resources. So then they feel less powerful. And then they sort of repeat the cycle. Okay, I have to do more to feel powerful and effective. That burns me up. Then I can't rest. Then I can't rejuvenate. And so I feel less powerful. And so I have to keep continuing the cycle, right? Yeah, does this make sense? All right, any questions about that before we take a break? Okay, all right. Again, you know, in your abundant spare time, keep reading from Worsley's book, as well as the book by Hicks and Mole. And that gives us a good sense of like the elements and the officials. And so let's take a break until 10 after. So we'll come back at 10:10 and we'll talk about the kidney, and then we'll kind of just do a quick summary. All right, see you in about 12 minutes.
All right.
All right, so continuing our discussion about the water. So I want to talk a little bit about fear and how the two officials deal with fear. So the bladder, being more yang, is about managing resources, what we do with the resources that are generated by the zong, in this case, the kidney. So the bladder is going to be, deals with fear by being clever and resourceful, by making great use of what it has available, making great use of its resources. That's where the word resourcefulness comes from. I think they did a remake recently of this show that was on, I think in like the maybe 70s or early 80s, called MacGyver. I've never heard of it, but look it up. And MacGyver was like this really clever dude who would always, I mean, like if he found himself like trapped in a basement by the bad guys, if he had like a paper clip, a belt, a rubber band, and some, you know, and some bleach, like he'd figure out a way to get out, right? Like he was so masterful. Right? He could use his cleverness and resourcefulness to overcome an oppressing force, right? So that's how he would deal it. So, bladder CFs often manifest as resourceful or very unresourceful, or very clever or seeming lacking in cleverness. And so that's the way the sort of like the more yang bladder deals with fear, to keep it from freaking out. Because wood courage, like the gallbladder courage, allows us to take action in the face of a threat, right? It allows us to make a decision and then to take an action to kind of step out and either wait or attack, wait or engage, right? It's more about the dealing with the conflict. Bladder and kidney is the kidney courage. Bladder courage is more like, how do I not freak out? Think about bladder 58, fly and scatter. How do I not freak out and run around, just like a frightened animal? Like, they urinate themselves, they defecate themselves, and then they flee or they freeze. They become paralyzed, right? Because that's the way water is. On a very yin aspect, water in a very yin manifestation, that's ice, that's frozen, that's contracted, that's still, that's stuck, that's paralyzed. Or water in its yang excited state moves more rapidly, right? So that's how it shows up around the bladder. And the kidney courage is about, and the way kidneys deal with fear is they go in to connect to their inner resources, their wisdom, and their ability to be still in the face of threat. The ability to be still in the face of threat. There's a scene in The Phantom Menace, which was not a great Star Wars movie, but it's the one where Darth Maul, this character Darth Maul, and there's these two Jedi that are fighting this bad guy. And the bad guy is like really, he's quite terrifying. And so the older Jedi who's training the younger Jedi, played by Ewan McGregor, and I think it's like I can't remember his name, but he's a famous actor, like Liam Neeson. And he's this Jedi fighting this character, and they're going through this sort of like, I don't know, this industrial space where these energy barriers arise and then block them from each other, and then they go down, and and so they're occasionally facing each other, and then they have to wait for this energy barrier to drop, and then they can fight again. And so what does Qui-Gon do? Qui-Gon Jinn, like when the energy barrier goes up and they're separated temporarily and they can't fight each other, what does he do? He kneels down and meditates. And then as soon as the barrier goes down, he leaps into action, right? That's the water and the wood working together to be still and quiet the mind, quiet the passions, go inward, tap into your wisdom, tap into your power, and then manifest it appropriately. And so that's what you often see or don't see with somebody who resonates a lot with the kidney official, because the kidney official is responsible for the creation of power. Skill and ability stem from them, right? So the kidneys are literally like a battery. They move water and salts across the fluid membrane, and moving in this fluidic action, that's enabled by the nephrons in the kidneys, right? Puts our electrolytes to good use, because if you move electrical, if you create an electrical differential across a membrane, more energy, more electrons are activated, and that's power, that's electricity. And like I said, it's also cleansing and purifying. So that, we all know what happens if your kidneys aren't functioning, or then you have to be on dialysis. You have to have, like with the liver, you have to like purify and cleanse the fluids all the time. And you can only go couple 3 days without it. Otherwise you get very, very ill. So I've had a number of patients who are on dialysis. So when they travel, they have to make sure that there's some kind of a dialysis center, you know, within 2 or 3 days, you know, of their travel that they can, you know, go to within every 2 or 3 days. So this cleanses the blood, that cleanses the fluids, and it, excuse me, and it balances the minerals, right, with the fluids that it gets from the metal, right? Thinking about these minerals, right? These ions that come from the metal, right? And that empower the kidneys, the water element. So so the main aspects of the kidney are it empowers on a sort of like a larger scale. It not only empowers, generates power, right? And it's responsible for the creation of power. They knew this in the ancient times, right? When they said this in chapter 8 of the Ling Shu. The kidneys are responsible for the creation of power. So it empowers the flow of our purpose in the world, right? It empowers our potency. It in a way represents and allows us to connect with our depth, right? Our potential, our unrealized potential. This is like, and this represents at the deepest level, our virtues. On a more physical level, this would be like your DNA, like how big are you going to be? How strong are you going to be? What's your frame going to be like? What's your musculature going to be like? Right? So there's always the seed of the whole, right? In every part, right? So there's a picture of the whole within every part. This will be like your DNA in almost every cell that you have. So there's this holographic quality of like, just as like every cell contains the potential template for the entire organism, in every moment that you experience, you have the potential to be the best you that you can be, right? It's like the army, be all you can be. That's a very kidney statement, right? Because in every moment holds the seed or the potential for you to express yourself in a powerful way, to express and manifest your potency. And where does it come from? Who knows where it comes from? It comes from the abyss. You say like when we have all these sort of common along many cultures, we talk about going inside and connecting and or digging deep, right? Like any of you have ever been in any competition, right? That requires skill and ability, right? This is like, it comes from your dedication, the focus of your will. You know, you don't just, I mean, you may be naturally inclined to certain things, you know, we call them a prodigy, right? You see this a lot in sports. At a young age, they display, manifest this incredible potential, right? Because their skill and ability is already much higher than their peers, right? Like I remember this one guy, like Phelps, Michael Phelps, right? You know, he didn't just immediately have skill and ability. He had to create that power. He had to focus his will almost to the exclusion of almost everything else. I mean, he did the bare minimum to get through school, but his main focus of his will was to swimming. And he achieved great heights. He achieved great skill. He achieved great ability, right? And so these are like the seed of your superpowers. This is the potential for what makes you unique. There's a really funny movie called Napoleon Dynamite, and there's this really nerdy character, and he's always walking around with like nunchucks. He's always practicing nunchucks, and people are like, why are you doing that? And he's like, and he's like teenage years. He's like in high school. He's like, chicks dig dudes with mad skills, you know, like like some girl's gonna be attracted to his ability to like use nunchucks, right? I mean, what a dork, right? But that's the guy for you, right? So, but we all have this sense of like admiration for people who like apply great dedication to a thing to become masterful, right? You know, that's that's what like that's like sort of like what a real, hero kind of does. They're doing the 10,000 push-ups. They're doing, 10,000. I like the Beatles. They went and put in their 10,000 hours in Germany. They did, 2 to 4 shows a night, 4 to 5 nights a year, a week, and so they became incredibly dedicated to their art, and they became very skillful people, like, in all walks of life. We all recognize this. So what lubricates the unfolding of our destiny, which is really just the connection to and manifestation of our will by virtue of our drive, what lubricates that drive is the fluids that are under the domain of the kidney and the bladder, right? So the kidneys are responsible for the creation of power. The bladder then, as a fu, manages and navigates the wise and appropriate use of those resources in a way that furthers our goal to manifest our will and to achieve our destiny, right? So you've got this raw power, and then you've got the power station generating all this power, and then it's like the substations and the wire networks and the pipes that bring the water to your home, that navigates the amount of power that goes where, right? You don't want the amount of power coming into your home that is generated at the main power plant, right? That would burn you up. That would, right? It's too high a power. It has to be stepped down and regulated, right? It's a tremendous amount of power going through these high voltage lines that then goes to a substation that then goes to a pole that also has a regulator on it, that then goes into your house that has the fuse box, and then it goes to your toaster, right? You don't want it coming from Calvert Cliffs into your toaster, right? It would blow it up, right? It would last a millisecond, right? And imagine if you were plugged into that yourself, right? It's bad enough when you stick your finger in a toaster or a plug, right? Have you guys ever done electrical work around your house and screw up? It's like, right? And that's just 220 volts at 5 amps, right? So, you throw a toaster into someone is sitting in a bathtub, it'll kill them, right? So this power has to be regulated and stepped down. And made appropriate. That's how the bladder works with the small intestine to sort that out. Again, using the Li propriety from the heart. So there's this interconnection. But the kidney creates the power that we then draw from, that we use as a resource, our wisdom, which comes from introspection, our inner qualities, our inner strengths, our inner virtues, right? That we're just sort of born with. And when we use our bladder to manifest and tap into these resources wisely and appropriately, not too much, not too little, right? In a dynamic way, then we become skillful. We generate and develop our abilities, right? Like you guys are learning pulses, right? How many pulses have you taken roughly? Like if you had to guess, you've been taking pulses for how long? 3 trimesters, 2 trimesters?
2.5 or 3. Yeah, probably like 300 pulses,
Okay.
maybe more.
Right. So your skill, you've probably noticed, is increasing little by little in a gradual way, in a way that's kind of unfolding. Like, where does your skill come from? Like point to your body. Where's your pulse reading skill come from? Nowhere, right? I mean, it's everywhere and nowhere, right? I mean, that's your will, right? It's in every cell. But if you dissected the body, you wouldn't go, wow, there's a big concentration of will in their elbow. I mean, you can open up the kidney, there's no will in there, right? So like, where the hell does it come from? It comes from nowhere. That's the abyss, right? It's like, like it's the very activation of, it's the lightning meeting the primordial soup, right? So the Shen is the lightning, the primordial soup is the kidneys, the jur, and then bam, the two come together. That's like, ovum and sperm, right? So so the kidney is responsible for the amount of potential and reserves that we do have, as well as the ability and the drive, that's your will, to manifest itself, right? Some people have no drive. So they've got a lot of potential, but it doesn't really get activated because they haven't activated their will, or they haven't connected to it, or their mind gets in the way and says, why bother? Or it won't, think going around the cycle, right? Like, I don't want to be like these people that are oppressive and tyrannical, so I'm not going to activate my will, for fear of being like an oppressor, for fear of being, abusive or a bully, right? Or, someone that they judge harshly as like abusing their power, right? Or, it might put me, if I manifest my will, it might be hard, it might put me in conflict with the world, or it might not be fun, or, or the earth's going to be really uncomfortable, or the metal's like, well, I don't really deserve to do that because I'm a sinner, I'm bad, I'm tainted, I'm stained, I'm unclean, I'm unworthy, right? And all this other BS that our brains say to ourselves, right? So, but the kidney is the root of the root. And so what you'll feel in the presence of people who are relatively more related to the kidney is a sense of strength, a sense of commitment, a sense of dedication, a sense of perseverance. I think I said wisdom, people that have like the ability to kind of penetrate their vision into the unknown future and kind of see, where is this river going, and then where can I interpolate that it will be moving forward. So these are people like get a good sense of what the trends are, or might even make the trends by bending, by bending the situation to their will. These would be like very famous designers. Like I used to work for Calvin Klein. There are people who manifested their will and brought it up through the wood very creatively in a way that was very aligned with their shen, their heart, their nature, to create something very powerful and very compelling, right? And that would be like a trendsetter. That would be like your visionary. Like I remember when Steve Jobs, was like, I don't even remember way back when Apple products started to become really famous, and he wanted things like he had a very specific vision, and he applied all of his will to manifesting that vision. And sometimes it brought him into conflict. I mean, he ended up actually being fired from his own company by the board he created. They kicked him out of his own company. He's like, what the hell? So they overpowered him and they out-clevered him, right? Because they couldn't take his single-minded will, because sometimes he was inappropriate. But I remember one time when these new lines of computers came out, and he said, well, people can have any color they want as long as it's white. I mean, that's imposing your will on everyone. Like, I want it white, it's going to be white, and white is it. And everyone's like, but this, but that. And he's like, white. And they're like, but, people want a variety, white. Like, even the internal components that no one would ever see had to look a certain way. That was how intense his will was to, generating a certain vision, right? So these would be like your captains of industry, your people that have a certain gravitas, right? Because again, the kidney is connected via the Shaoyin to the heart, and the heart is the supreme controller. So this is the power behind the throne. Or sometimes this actually drives us to be on the throne. Like in Game of Thrones, there's all these machinations and court intrigue and war and people physically or psychologically overpowering or manipulating others so they could be the person to sit on the Iron Throne, right? I don't know, you guys ever see Game of Thrones, or is that like too far back for you guys? Yeah, right. So, there's people that use like Littlefinger, who uses information, knowledge to gain power. And then there's other people like, I can't remember the guy's name, but he was like kind of burned. He was like one of the brothers. He was like burned. He's like this big dude. I mean, he used brute force, right? He developed skill and ability as a warrior, and he was a big dude, and he used brute force. Like I can't remember his name, but it's a while back. But you know what I'm talking about, right? So these are people that in their presence, you feel this sense of power, of perseverance, of strength, or a lack of that. The ability to be still in the face of threat or something, or an opponent that is possibly overpowering them. Sort of a David and Goliath kind of thing, right? David took on Goliath. How did he win? Through cleverness. He didn't like jump on Goliath's back and throw him to the ground and beat him to a pulp. He didn't overpower him. He used his resourcefulness and his skill and ability with whatever that's called, a slingshot, and hit him square in the face and knocked him out. Right? This guy was like twice his size. So, but interestingly enough, when you go to Italy and you see Michelangelo's David, you see this figure who's like incredibly well muscled, really cut, it's a very powerful, imposing figure. He made his hands and feet unnaturally large as a metaphor, as a statement, as an artistic statement that this guy could manage his power with cleverness and ability to overcome that which is larger and more powerful. They had a bigger army, right? So in a way, like when you're in the presence of this, it's not so much clever, it's about wisdom, it's about insight, because they're connecting to their Shen to see like a little bit further into the unknown future than we do, right? Yeah, and so if you think about what are our resources, physically our resources are our fluids, our chi, and so the main themes are like, how do I use my physical resources to attain power or skill or ability, right? So you could train to be the best, but if you overtrain, if you overtax yourself, you end up actually depleting yourself. And also just that sort of relationship between rest and recovery and application of power. Like, so if you're working out, you have to have times where you rest your body in a certain way, right? Or you're active in a certain way that helps like to rejuvenate. So like you're at a swim meet, you swim, and then you go get on the stationary bike and very slowly use the stationary bike or do some gentle windmills to move the lactic acid out of your body. What's the lactic acid? It's in your blood. You have to move the fluids to cool this hot mineralized lactic acid, this carbon dioxide, whatever, carbon dioxide gas in your blood. You have to move that out, right? So that's the kidney and bladder working together. So that's an appropriate use of your power, not to like then go and work out really hard. Like you have to like, and then you have to rest and recover. You have to get enough sleep. You have to get enough water, right? You have to get foods that have appropriate fluid and mineral content, right? And nutrient content. So on the physical level, we've got our fluids and we've got our chi and our jing, and I'll get to jing in a bit. And then on a mental emotional level, right? These are all the things that we use in the world that are managed by the bladder in a clever way that's appropriate, that doesn't underutilize or overutilize our resources. And this would be like your time, your attention, and your money, right? We talk about putting our blood, sweat, and tears into this. Your blood, that houses the shen, that's your heart. So you're putting your heart into it, your sweat, which means you're taking effective action, you're working, because if you're working hard, you'll eventually generate heat, and that heat will need to move out as sweat and tears, right? These other fluids, this is the transformation, blood, sweat, tears, and urine, right? But we don't really talk about that. That's not too sexy, right? We don't want to say, I put my urine into this, right? Not too attractive, but this means your transformation is occurring by utilizing and transforming your fluids. Yu Wan Su was absolutely right. Right? So another theme, especially for water CFs and especially for kidneys, especially, is how much time, money, and chi do I have? Right? Imagine you're on a road trip and you decide to stop at a 7-Eleven or a Royal Farms, and you want to go to the ATM, which is that's under the management of the bladder, by the way, right? That distributes the funds, the resources to the regions and cities. In this case, you're going to the beach, so you're more in a region, right? You're like, outside of Salisbury at an ATM at Royal Farms, right? That's the bladder that puts the money there, right? So, but it doesn't create the money, right? That's the kidney. So that's the bank. That's your bank in a way. That's your reserves, right? That's your savings account. Checking is more bladder, savings is more kidney. You go to the ATM and all of a sudden, it's declined. And you look and you've got $11.46. Well, you're going to freak out, right? I mean, you're going to panic a little bit. I imagine you will not be very calm if you see that. Well, I thought I had thousands of dollars in here. Shit, like I've got $11.46. What? I can't use that, right? If money is power, I've got very little power. So there's not much skill and ability. I'm not going to be able to get the Twizzlers and the coffee, like I can't get the fried chicken now, right? So, okay, well, you're going to panic a little bit. So the ability to be kind of like still and not freak out, that's the kidney, right? The ability to tap into and utilize and regenerate our reserves, that's the kidney, right? And it works with the bladder to do that in a clever, efficient way. So this is about your reserves, and that brings us to the conversation about Jing. If I can find my notes about Jing. Yeah, here we go. So with the Jing, this is it's the seed, again, thinking about water, wintertime. The earth itself becomes a seed in the wintertime, right? Everything contracts and goes underground, right? Because there's less light, there's more dark, so it becomes more yin. And the earth as an organism moves inward, it contracts, right? At our latitude becomes colder. And so it's about the seed, right? And actually in herbal medicine, if you want to generate the Jing and help build the kidney yin and the Jing, you're going to use a lot of seeds, right? You're going to use, if the Shen is arising at a yin time at night, you're an insomniac, you're going to use a lot of things that thrive in the water, like shells and heavy minerals that thrive in the ground, that are more yin, that are cold, right? And so your Jing is your essence. This is the refined, distilled, and cherished energy source that is seen as a treasured liquid. So in a way, this is like not just the money you have in your bank account, but this is like the gold that you have in the safe deposit box or in your safe, right? You use that sparingly, right? because that is the most potent. So there's pre-heaven and post-heaven essence or Jing. The pre-heaven is what you get from your parents. So when they say pre and post-heaven, that's like before and after you're born. In a way, actually before and after you're conceived, right? So, but I would say really like conception to birth is more pre-heaven, you know, on a physical level, right? Because before we're conceived, there's really nothing, right? That's in the, that's so hidden that we can't even, we only use our imagination, right? Which is in a very yin place. So you can't cut yourself open. You can't go up to someone and say, hey, you see my imagination? No, they can't see that. It's inside you, right? It's the hidden of the hidden, right? But this is what nourishes the embryo and the fetus as it goes through the stages of development. And it's interesting that if you look like etymologically, as the fetus develops from 2 cells to baby, in a way, when it's forming, when the fetus is developing and forming, it kind of mimics the whole evolution of the human being from like this single-celled organism into these tadpole-looking creatures, right? Into these sort of quasi-fishy mammal-looking creatures, like toad-looking creatures, into like us. And it's kind of like it mimics the whole evolutionary development from single-celled organism to us. And I think that that's really interesting. If you look at the fetus at the different stages of development, it kind of mimics our etymology as our development as a species. You know, we were the single-celled organism, and we were water-based creatures, and then we crawled up on land, and then we were these primitive land-looking, you know, land-based creatures, and then it developed into like this, you know, erect bipedal organism. So that's pretty wild. So when you're in utero from your parents, you only get these amount of genes from your mother, and you get these genes from your dad or your, you know, whatever, right? So you get if you're a man, you get an X chromosome and a Y chromosome. If you're a woman, you get an X chromosome and another X chromosome, but that's all you got. That's all that's deposited in the pre-heavenly bank. That's it. Some people are born into wealthy families. Some people are born into middle-class families. Some people are born into impoverished families, right? So like my mom's family, like they were dirt poor, and I mean dirt poor, right? When they were young, when my grandparents were younger. They got like wiped out in the Depression. My grandfather was an orphan. It was pretty brutal. And then there's some people born with like a lot of drive, like my other grandparents that came from Italy and Sicily. Like they weren't wealthy, they didn't have a lot of money, but they worked really hard. They were very clever, and they did quite well for themselves. I mean, we didn't have a yacht, but they were doing okay, right? For Italian immigrants. So this is like, the potential that you're given in terms of physical and psycho-emotional and spirit level resources. And that's what we then make use of in the post-heavenly essence, which is the refined and extracted from the food and the fluids by the stomach and spleen after birth, right? So it adds to the savings account, right? You can still deposit into savings, right? Because you can work to generate income after you're born, right? After you're an adult, you've developed enough where you can now go up and work, right? We don't want 5-year-olds to work. We don't want 5-year-olds earning money, right? Because that would be too depleting. We want them to be more yin and absorb information and learning and knowledge and have fun and be kids with no responsibilities. That's water, right? So eventually they develop enough where they can be resourceful for themselves, right? They can gain their own resources and add to their bank accounts, right? That they inherited as kids. So in a way, this is a big theme for a lot of especially kidney CFs, which is like, what are the resources that I have at my disposal that allow me to be powerful in the world? And so you can be a more potent, I would say, generally you can be a more potent force in the world, especially as like water gives birth to the wood for change, if you amassed a great fortune, right? Because money is power, or your skills, right? Like look at like Bono, he's a singer, right? The dude moves sound through air. That's what he does, right? But he taps into his essence and brings forth something he brings forth his self, his drive. He was always very driven to express himself creatively, to enliven the world, fire, right? And look at what he's done. He's put his power, that is his celebrity status and his considerable finances, because he became very wealthy in the process of being fully devoted to his craft. He did nothing else. He didn't like, oh, I'm also going to work on cars, and I'm also going to, learn how to play violin, and I'm also going to be a master gardener. No, singer. That's it. Singer, songwriter, and poet. And he became this really, he amassed a fortune. And so what did he do? He put his money to use to end the AIDS crisis, to, help with apartheid, all kinds of stuff, right? So in a way, we look to people who've developed skill and ability or some kind of power, and those are the people that can then move into wood and create great change. They can be a potent force, and in the process of that, they manifest their destiny, i.e. legacy, right? No one's going to, it'll be a long time before people forget Bono. It'll be maybe a century before people forget Bono, right? Right? People who reach this pinnacle, that's manifesting your destiny. That's empowered, lubricated, and financed by your Jing and the use of your Jing through your will. So when you're with people who resonate a lot with the kidneys, you'll get this sense of like these themes of power, powerlessness, reserves, resources, perseverance, right? That's your zhe, your grit, as well as a sense of wisdom and insight, and maybe even a sense of cleverness, right? So these are some of the things that are going to show up, with the water CF, and particularly someone who deals with the kidney, right? There's this sense of potency in them, and that potency could be physical, like, long story, but I would come in contact with like these professional wrestlers. I'm not a professional wrestler. I don't look anything like a professional wrestler. These dudes could break me in half just with one hand, right? So, but like in their presence, like I felt fear. Like it wasn't logical. I knew in my mind that they're not just gonna like lose their shit and just kill me, right? But they could have. Right? There's always that part where you're like, well, they might, right? So there's this sense of imminence, right? There's this sense of wariness. And that's the power that just radiates from somebody who's very resonant with the kidney, which is very different than all of the other zong, right? So people who have a lot of potential, people who have a lot of physical power, right? They need to lubricate their drive by remaining connected to the heart, so it's appropriate, so they don't overdo it, they don't burn the candle at both ends, or underutilize. That's the soup, that the flame of passion, the fires of the yuan qi aren't activated, so the soup isn't made. Nothing gets transformed. The qi, the qi breaths don't get transformed from it. The bladder has nothing to use. Like there's, you've got this power plant, and you've got the water that's moving underneath it. Maybe it's a hydroelectric power plant, but it's not turned on. No one's activated it. So it's dormant. So the water's flowing, under the power plant through the dam, but it's not activated, so nothing happens. No power is generated. So there's this quality of activation. And so what you'll see, what gets in the way of a lot of water CFs is wind and cold, or the psychological correlates of that, which might be a lot of changing circumstances. So they're not able to focus their power. Their circumstances are changing so much that they're not able to sort of contain their power in one place. Think about somebody who's like on the run, like fleeing from the law, and you don't have a lot of money. And so you spend a lot of your time on the road, evading authority. You can't set down roots, you know? You have to be very wary, always on the move. Can't spend the night at the same place twice. Like you look at like when people are at war and you've got like some tribal, you know, you've like people that were like on the kill list for the Americans, like they were in the Taliban or Al Qaeda, right? They could never spend this, you know, more than 1 or 2 nights in any place. They were always on the move, and that takes a lot of resources. You can't contain and generate more power if you're constantly diffused, right? If your energy is flooding out in all directions, right? So you may get this sense with someone that they're kind of like wasting their time, wasting their money, wasting their God-given talents, you know, if you believe in that, right? So they're wasting their resources. And your greatest resources are your inner strengths, your inner qualities, but they only become strong if you apply your will to them. Just like you only become physically strong if you work at it, right? And you only get good skill and ability at anything if you work at it, if you apply your will, your blood, sweat, and tears. So this is like a big, big theme. And then one of the other things that shows up is this relationship between the manifest and the unmanifest, and your reserves and the expenditure of reserves. So a lot of people that resonate with the water have money issues, and they don't like people knowing how much money they have. So they don't like to know, they don't want other people to know when they're up, and they don't want people to know when they're down. They don't want people to know when they're flush. They don't want people to know when they're broke, right? Because that leaves them vulnerable to either thievery or manipulation, right? If I am impoverished, I don't have a lot of choices. I may need this job so badly, my survival depends on it, that I can't really apply my own will. I have to do what the boss says. If I think, oh, through my wisdom and cleverness, I should do it this way, but the boss says do it that way. If I do keep doing it this way, guess what? That create conflict, right? And if we see this all the time, people with a lot of money are able to exert more power. Politically, socially, right? People who are very impoverished are very easily taken advantage of, right? If you think about a new immigrant that comes to this country and uses all their perseverance and cleverness to get here, and they're very poor, it's easy for them to be taken advantage of, right? So they could be the strongest person on earth. They could be able to bench 450. It doesn't matter. They don't have a lot of socio-political power, right? So this is going to be a big theme. So what comes from that, because how much power they have or don't have, secrecy and trust and fearfulness become another theme. So secret, like what drives secrecy is fear. What drives intense secrecy is paranoia. If you think about these like doomsday preppers who like are off the grid, because if I'm connected to the power lines, I can be controlled and manipulated. If I'm connected to the internet via a cell phone, the NSA could spy on me and manipulate me. If I have an unknown identity, right? The IRS won't come after me and tax my resources. You know what I mean? and they're very self-reliant. They rely on themselves, but they live a very contracted existence. They have to be out in the wilderness. They have to be out in the regions, off the grid. So their life is very small. It's very shrunken. It's very contracted. They're not going to engage with a lot of people. They're not going to be connected to the grid socially, resourcefully, informationally, right? So you'll see this with people who are really, they kind of have this paranoia. And what does that paranoia do? It shrinks their world. They're not going to have a lot of friends. They're not going to have a lot of interactions with people. Why? Because it's a threat. It could take away their power. It could limit their power, right? So what looks like freedom is really about the power to make choices for oneself about how one manifests their own destiny. All right. And this is empowered by the Yuan Qi, which is empowered by the kidney yin and yang interacting at Ming Men to generate this Yuan Qi, which is then deposited, right, as bladder essence, right? It's yang because it's going up. It's moving up the back to be deposited into the AEPs, right, which are where we needle into these associated effect points in the inner bladder line, which is where we go to empower the yang functionality of the organs. And what transmits the Yuan Qi from these AEPs to each source point is the triple heater mechanism. So if you're off the grid, you're not engaging the triple heater, right? So these people are not going to be very sociable. They're not going to feel very warm. There's not a lot of kidney yang. Everything is going towards survival. It's not about going out and being happy in the world. It's about this sort of minimal existence. Does this make sense? All right. Clearly, we need a break. So why don't we take another 10 minutes and we'll come back at 10 after.
All right. Like, I don't want to use the word drive, but you know, close to it,
It comes from the sure will. Yeah.
from the sure will. If it's like, is there some way as far as like it being temporarily just you're not temporarily motivated, but you still feel like you're motivated, but you're not able to just get that spark to get it going. Like, is there like like someone who, is there a middle ground is what I'm saying? Like, we've covered the extremes, and then there's that little fudge room in the middle of where they could teeter to either side.
Mm-hmm.
In that particular case, how do you activate that, that willpower if they're kind of like still balanced in the middle, like you mentioned, the minimalist, who is all disconnected, but they're not, maybe they're not aware because they're not present to activate that willpower. Am I making sense?
I'm not sure what your question is. Like, basically, how do you activate people's willpower?
Well, how would you activate, or how would you recognize, and let's use that minimalist as that example.
Now, when you say minimalist, are you talking about pathologically deficient? Or are you talking about someone who's healthy and balanced, but tends more towards, the yin nature? Like, I'm not really sure what you're talking about.
So like the person who would be balanced, but they're not exhibiting that drive.
Mm-hmm.
They're not exhibiting that drive. It's kind of like having I have wood, but if I don't have that spark, I don't have that fire.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's kind of like that. So what I'm saying is you see that it's present,
mm-hmm.
but they don't have that, they don't have the thing that gets it started. Like
Yeah.
if it was flowing and you mentioned the generator is not engaged,
Yeah.
no generation of power.
Yeah.
So what I'm saying is like,
Right.
it isn't, how is that activated if it becomes to that point?
I understand. So basically I have to assess, and again, like all treatment planning comes down to nourishing the interior, supporting the normal, safeguarding the exterior / expelling the evil, right? Nourishing the Zen authentic chi, expelling the Shay evil chi. So I'm looking at, is there something getting in the way of them activating their potential and manifesting their will? Or either like from a physical level, they could be like, that might look like somebody who's like seriously ill for a long time and has become debilitated. So they have like maybe like had chronic fatigue, right? Or people with Lyme disease or autoimmune diseases, right? Or kidney diseases. They just don't have the chi to do what they feel called to do, right? This happens a lot with athletes, right? I get it. I'm, like my life is about being a professional dancer or an athlete, and then I blow out my knee. Now I can't dance. Now I can't play football. Now I can't run track. What do I do? So it's in how do they relate to that? That's determines health versus ill health. And then on the other side, they might be very deficient, like the conditions that I mentioned, chronic fatigue, like long-standing chronic illness can be depleting. So this is really about nourishing the resources needed to activate, to manifest their will, right? We have to get them off of bed rest. We have to get them out of the hospital. We have to get them strong enough to move around and get on their own, back on their own 2 feet, right? Remember Sandy, who came in with the ankle. I did the E-stim, made her foot move, right? Right? She has like all the will in the world, man. Oh my God. Will, right? I mean, she is so driven, and what does she do? Search and rescue. Legislation. She works in the corridors of power as a bladder to manage these knucklehead, she's always calling like these knucklehead politicians doing really dumb things, making stupid decisions. There's also really smart, good people too, but they're not a problem if they're not a problem. So, but she, injures her wrist. She breaks her ankle, sprained one ankle, broke the other ankle, right? Not paying attention. She walked off a curb. She's looking at her phone. She's like, oh crap. Stepped off a curb, like wasn't aware of the curb there and how tall it was because there's a lot of construction around the State House in Annapolis, and she seriously messed herself up, man. So that's more about, correcting and, expelling the evil chi and nourishing the interior so they can do that. So, on a psycho-emotional level, like, is somebody in a relationship that's maybe taxing their money? Like maybe they have like one of my friends, like her first husband was secretly like stealing money and spending it on, back in those days, you had like these 900 numbers, like phone sex. Before the internet, there was phone sex. So this is like in the 80s. And so he was spending all his money like gambling and on phone sex. Like a ton of money, right? So like that's Sheichi, right? That's someone who is outside of her psycho-emotionally, like keeping her down by siphoning off resources. So like, is somebody engaged in some kind of activity like that's unwholesome for their vitality, that over depletes their resources of chi, money, attention, love, whatever, right? Time. And then that has to be expelled, right? That has to be transformed, that has to be rectified, right? And oftentimes your needle actions will be more sedating, right? And then you also have to then help generate their internal wisdom, their connection to their self, which is through yin activities, right? Because this is all internal. So I have to be able to connect to what's inside: meditation, qigong, hobbies, stillness, rest, sleep, right? To nourish. So that's how you do it. And then you also manage these by virtue of the points on the channels. So these, might be like upper kidney points. These might be like kidney 1 or kidney 2 to like expel the heat, right? Or the deficient heat, or, like every patient I've ever had who's been diagnosed with plantar fasciitis, not one exception. This is weird because in Chinese medicine, there's almost always an exception. And I thought I was going to have this one patient that was like the one exception to like I know, like the 500 people I've treated with plantar fasciitis, right? Every single one of them, with no exceptions, not only are they burning the candle at both ends, but they're sticking a wick in the middle and burning that one. I mean, they are like, oh my God, they are like so overworked, so overtaxed, so overdepleted, psychologically, bladder, nervous system, burning up, right? If you don't want to leave your refrigerator, you don't want to leave, your electrical, whatever, running all the time, right? It burns up, right? I mean, you guys don't use hair dryers. I don't use a hair dryer, but like, you don't want to leave that on all the time, right? You don't want to leave anything on all the time. I mean, it's not, unless it's built to do that, like your fridge. But even then, it's periods of rest and on and off, right? So we have to have that. So if we're burning up too much yang, we deplete the yin, right? Because remember, they're mutually arising, but mutually consuming, right? Imagine if it's nighttime all the time. Like if you suddenly move to Alaska, where it doesn't, like 6 months out of the year, I mean, it may be light, you go a little crazy. There's even a great movie called Insomnia. They made an amazing remake with Al Pacino, by the way. You should see it. So anyway, like that yang like depletes us, every single plantar fasciitis person. And where does that occur? The kidney 1 and the space between kidney 1 and kidney 2. The plantar fascia, right? So that becomes inflamed because people are overtaxing themselves. They're burning up their yin. So you may need to expel the Shei Qi, or in this case, expel the unwholesome activity that is inappropriately burning up their resources of time, money, qi, shen, attention. And then if it's really severe, then blood and body fluids. And if it's really, really severe, then it's jing. Right? That's like crystal meth, right? That, like, if you want to lose some jing, start smoking crack and smoking crystal meth. And you look at what happens to people. I mean, you see, if you Google pictures of people like before and after 6 months or a year of taking crystal meth, I mean, it's just, oh my God, it's horrible. It's disfiguring. It's literally affects the bones. So that's how you do it. By virtue of the points, you either on a physical level expel the pathogenic factor, or on a psycho-emotional level, you expel the offending, unwholesome activity. And that activity could be including like their thoughts and their beliefs, that when they're living in those stories or in these deeply established beliefs, are depleting. And that will often show up in the nervous system as distraction. That's the Shei Qi that really affects the water, what distracts us, what draws our inner resources away from the Zhi will that's focused on becoming the wood, like sprouting and growing and moving towards a goal, right? Now, the water CF doesn't have a goal in mind. They're the people that, how much is enough? Like, when is enough enough? It's never enough. Like in that movie, Wall Street, how many yachts can you water ski behind? Like It's never enough, right? Because they come from the abyss, they're moving towards the abyss. How do you define that? It's undefined. There was a guy who did some research on like the uber wealthy, and he reached out to about 24 people. And amazingly, he said about 18 of them got back to him and agreed to an interview. And to a person, they all said, and these are people with like billions with a B dollars. And they all said variations on the same theme. You know, if I just had like X amount, then I could relax. Right? And of course, X amount was more than they had. I mean, this is bizarre because again, water, unless it's contagious, floods everywhere. It's undefined. So fear is undefined. Phobias, there's no reason. Like, why should you be afraid of a spider? Like, you're 1,000,000 times heavier than a spider, right? At the worst, the venom make you sick, right? Like, why would you be afraid? Like, why, like me, like crickets just freak me out, man. I just hate them. But I love every other insect. I actually like spiders, and snakes and things like that. That doesn't, but you know, you put a cricket on me and I'm like, oh my God, I'll squeal like a girl. And so, you know, why? Phobias are just like ill-defined. They make no sense. That's why they're phobias, right? It's this primal thing, you know? So that's how you treat it. That's how you stimulate that spark, by doing kidney points that activate and nourish the kidney yin, the kidney yang, the kidney qi. And then you bring that up via the upper kidney points to transport that jing up into the chest where the heart and the pericardium are, to bring it to our awareness so we can go, oh my God, I got some skills. I have some potential. I could really do something. We activate the inner bladder line points to give us the chi we need to get stuff done on a physical level and on a mental emotional level. And then we do the outer bladder line points to align this and activate that aspect of the Shen that relates to a particular, you know, organ system that we're working with, the Shen of the heart Shen, the Shen of the wood, the Hun, right? The Hun Shen, the Po Shen, the Zhi Shen, the Yi Shen, to imagine and perceive of possibility that's flavored according to each of the meridian, each of the organ systems, each of the elements. Like I can now imagine myself as connected to everything. I'm actually a part of the oneness. I'm constantly connected all the time. To activate the Hun Shen. You know what? I do have a purpose in life. I may not be clear about it. I may not have the clarity, but I do have the blood and the chi and the imagination to imagine something better, bigger, more, right? And so on through the elements, right? So does that make sense? Using the points on the meridians to expel the Shei Qi on a physical level and mental emotional level, and to do points on the kidney and bladder to enhance the physical resources, the Yuan Qi, kidney yin, kidney yang, kidney qi, maybe, and then practices, habits that cultivate the Jing, Qigong, Tai Chi, meditation, you know, Taoist Neigong exercises, right? Gong perfection, Nei, interior, inner, like inner perfecting exercises. You know, how do I perfect and enhance the interior, what's inside? That's your Qi, that's your Shen, right? Your resources, your 5 substances. Does this make sense? I know it's a long-winded answer, but we had the time, so.
Yeah, it makes sense.
All right.
Yeah.
All right, so there you have it. If you have any other questions, feel free to text me or email me or even call. And then next class, we'll talk about the wood.
Cool.
All right.
Good.
Great
Thanks.
weekend.
Thank you.
Great weekend, fellas. Be good.
You too. Yeah.
Bye-bye.